Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Community Conversations. Don't adjust your radio. I know you're used to hearing Jane Nielsen at this time, but I have once again hijacked the airwaves. It is the month of October, and it is Meet the Blind Month. And because it's Meet the Blind Month, I wanted to actually introduce you to a couple of blind people. We've had blind people on before, obviously, but I wanted someone to come on and talk about blindness. And so we have actually two people in studio. We'll hear from one of them this week and one of them next week, and they'll talk to us about blindness. With us today, someone I've literally known for decades. It is Barbara Beach Walker Loos. Do I have that correct, Barbara?
Yes, you do.
All right.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Tell us about yourself, about your background, and tell us who is Barbara. I'll call you Barbara Loos.
I was born in Lincoln, but I lived in Weeping Water, Nebraska, which is a small town about 35 miles from Lincoln. And I'm the youngest of three. My brother is about 6+ years older than I am, and my sister is 14 months older than I am. She and I are both blind. We went to the School for the Blind in Nebraska City. I graduated from there, as did she a year earlier. Our brother graduated from Weeping Water High School. We all went on to college. He went to Doane, and Lori and I both went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I got a degree in teaching with a major in English, and I didn't ever really end up doing that is to say, teaching secondary English. For some reason, it just didn't happen that way.
Somehow I can see you as an English teacher. That's an interesting picture.
Well, that's what I wanted to be. As it turned out, the job I actually got was working with blind people. And at first I thought that was just kind of a being shoved into the corner somewhere and not an acceptance of the fact that I was able to teach people in a regular schoolroom and that kind of thing. But after a while, it became apparent to me that really working with other blind people was a thing that was good for me, and I hope for other blind folks. And when I started out, after I got out of high school, and even after I got out of college, I was trying to figure out where I belonged in the network of blind folks that I knew and what we were doing. And there were several organizations of the blind around, and I went fairly naturally into the one that was having a convention every year at Nebraska City. It was some alumni of the school, and then there were some other folks in there too. And it had become affiliated with the American Council of the Blind for a year or so. I can't remember how many years that was, but in 1975, some of us decided that really didn't make sense because it wasn't really making anything happen that seemed sensible for us here in Nebraska. And so we disengaged from that, and it continued to be an organization that did some things legislatively and stuff like that for quite a while. In 1974, I had gone to the Iowa Commission for the Blind. We had been given a chance to go to any state agency or any agency we wanted to go to. By then, I was working there at what was then the Nebraska Rehabilitation Services for the Visually Impaired under the Department of Public Institutions. We were trying to reinvent ourselves there, I think. And I had the opportunity to go to the Iowa Commission for the Blind, and I talked with Kenneth Jernigan, who everybody at the School for the Blind had sort of maligned and thought was not someone you wanted to get connected with, and the Federation wasn't an organization you wanted to get connected with either back then. And so, but I found out otherwise, and so had decided to get involved in the National Federation of the Blind, and soon became president of the Lincoln chapter like a month after I joined.
I'm not at all surprised.
In 1975, that was when we decided we needed to get the Nebraska City entity out of the American Council of the Blind and have it be its own entity.
Let me ask you this. You said that you were at Nebraska City. Do you remember what years you were there?
Yes, I started in 1955. I was 4 years old, and although the cutoff is supposed to be October sometime, my birthday's at the end of December, and I started early, so my first almost the whole semester was as a 4-year-old. But my sister had started the year before. Her birthday is in October, and so she qualified to go that year. And because we were close, our parents decided not to have me be going 2 years later, which I think was a good idea on their part. So I went there, and I graduated in 1968.
So you spent, it sounds like, about 13 years there.
I did.
How did that experience at Nebraska City inform your later views on what would become your philosophy on blindness?
I think in terms of academics, it did an excellent job. I think that we learned how to milk resources. We didn't have the latest and greatest a lot of times. By the time things got brailled, they were sometimes out of date, but they were still usable, and some, like literature and things like that, are timeless. So if you get them available, they just stay fine. So academically, I think it was a very good education. It prepared me well to go on to college and also to do whatever else I was going to do in life. Philosophically, I think that it was a little more protective than I think may have been a good idea in terms of what we participated in with respect to other blind people. We did go to other states for wrestling, cheerleading tournaments and things like that, which was good. We did participate in plays and those kinds of things. And so again, in that type of participatory role, we really did do a lot of things that other folks were doing. But the things that were happening in the world with respect to discrimination, with respect to how to live in the world with the kinds of things that people would have low expectations about, we really didn't have as much exposure to those things as I think would have been a good idea. Some of us did go to the public high school for a few classes as juniors and seniors. That was good in one sense. It did help us to learn that we were going to need to get readers for a lot of things that weren't available in Braille or audio form. It did give us exposure to how other classroom settings worked that didn't involve having some kind of alternatives for blind people, like, they'd be doing the blackboard thing or just have the overheads with no descriptions and things like that we needed to learn how to do.
Do you remember when your first NFB Nebraska convention was? Did you say 1974?
1975 would have been my first NFB convention. We had people come mostly from Iowa, who were involved in legislative efforts, and there were folks who would invite us to come to events that were happening. My sister and I sometimes would play the guitar and sing, and we'd be invited to some of those functions to do that. And I think that the hope was that we would also learn about what the Federation was doing, and we did pay attention. And in 1971, the Nebraska affiliate was reorganized. There had been a convention here in Omaha in 1955 of the National Federation of the Blind, but at that time, I wasn't old enough to know anything about any of that. But in 1971, my sister and I were at the university, and the people who were doing the reorganizing came and spoke with us, and we thought about it some, but we didn't go to the organizing meeting. It was in Omaha, and there wasn't transportation. And back then, that was enough to convince us that, we just wouldn't go. We did start getting the Braille monitor. It caused us to do a lot of thinking and soul searching, but it wasn't until 1974 that the Braille monitor that came out had an article in it, the banquet speech from that year, which was called "Blindness is Literature Against Us." And it also had an article in it that had to do with a blind mother fighting for to keep her children from being corrupted by society's ways of doing things. I wasn't married then, I didn't have children then, but the article was compelling. And the "Is Literature Against Us" was a very compelling speech, too.
It is. It's one of I call it the trilogy. I think of those as three of my favorite speeches that Dr. Jernigan did. Speaking of whom, you mentioned you met Dr. Jernigan. Tell us about him.
In person, he was a very dynamic, listening human being. He cared a lot about a lot of things. He had a wide range of interests, a wide range of expectations, and always focused on making life better, no matter who you were, no matter what your situation was. And that wasn't just for blind people, it was for anyone. The people he hired, he would ask them questions that had nothing to do with blindness, but he wanted to know what kind of a person that human being was and how that person would fit into the whole dynamic of what he wanted to do and to have happen. When he was at the Commission for the Blind, which is when I first met him, at the Iowa Commission for the Blind, we had a discussion about a lot of things, and one of the things that forever is with me is that I talked about, well, here things seem to be going very well, blind people seem to be getting good training, it's all just wonderful. But in Nebraska, the Federation chapter that's where I live, there's a lot of like coffee donut kind of things. People don't seem to be doing much of, with issues, and I'm interested in issues and stuff like that. And we had I talked a little that way, and then he said, "And what are you doing about that?" He didn't chastise me about it. He asked me that question and then waited, gave me a chance to think about it. And we discussed what kinds of things were happening in Nebraska at that time. And of course, by then, I was working at the Agency for the Blind. I had started in 1973 on contract, and I had worked there in various capacities. And at one point I had overheard my counselor and someone else saying, well, because I wasn't making the regular full-time pay, and I heard the counselor and whoever say, well, she seems to be happy or whatever. And it dawned on me somewhere along the line that because some of us had made some waves during the time we were in college, trying to get readers to be paid on time and things like that, to wonder, was I really hired because I had skills to offer, or had I been hired to keep me quiet, or keep me into a certain place and perspective? And that started making me think about what I was doing. There was a change in the directorship at the agency in 1974. The Federation had been very instrumental in having that change happen, from Dean McDermott being in charge to Dr. Nieman being in charge. And so there was a lot to think about that year and during that time, and about what we were wanting to do as blind people in Nebraska. And so all of that just fed into what was happening within me as a blind person myself, and what my own expectations could be. And it really was life-changing to be at the Iowa Commission for the Blind then, and to observe blind people just doing what they wanted to do. And if they were not doing that, to have the option of getting the kind of training that would make it possible for them to do that. I wanted that here in Nebraska, and it became a part of making that happen.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Nieman. We lost him a few months ago. Tell us about him and what he was like to work for.
He was, first and foremost, I think, a philosopher and professor.
Yes, he was.
And
I loved his intellect.
Yeah, he was. That was a lot of who he was and a lot of what he brought here. In terms of having folks working under him who were very different from each other and that kind of thing, sometimes I think it was more interesting to him to have people express what they thought about something and that kind of thing than to be the kind of director of an agency who would meld people, harmonize them, have them all working toward the same specific goal. He liked the push and pull, the having things be somewhat off balance and have you have to think about how to bring it together and that kind of thing. And so in some senses it was very interesting to work for him. In some senses, for a person like me, it was very frustrating.
You were the director of the Orientation Center at the Nebraska Agency for a time, were you not? I
was. That happened from 1978 through part of 1981. And it was a very interesting job to have. At the time that I was going to do that, by then I had married Jim Walker, and we both had worked in the Orientation Center for a while. If one of us was going to direct it, the other one couldn't work in that part of the agency because there are laws about that in state government that prohibit that kind of thing. And so that was both a professional and a personal conversation for us.
Tell me about the first day that you met Jim Walker.
Well, the very first day that I met him was at a seminar in Des Moines in the convention in 1975 in Chicago. Dr. Jernigan had asked me to come to a seminar for the Federation, a leadership seminar, and it was going to take place over the Labor Day weekend of that year. And that seminar also included Jim Walker. And at that time, he was very direct, very hard-charging kind of person. I felt a little like he was kind of what I had thought that Federationists were all like as a person at the School for the Blind back several years previously. Hard-charging, my way or the highway kind of people.
Abrasive
or whatever.
And uncompromising, perhaps.
And that kind of thing. And so it was really kind of, and then when I found out that, he came here for an interview the following year, and in fact was hired. And I remember having a conversation with Dr. Jernigan at the time saying, wow, I don't know. I mean, he is really very kind of one way or whatever. And he said, what you need to do is to help him love you, which is part of what he did. That was one of the ways that Dr. Jernigan helped people to learn about each other and to learn about themselves and to begin to be able to work with each other. And so I changed my mindset about him, knowing that he was going to be here. And his first day here was May 10th of 1976. And so by the following year, he was seeming to be interested in me beyond the work type of relationship. At first, I wasn't really sure whether I thought that was a good thing or not, but he asked me things like, "Are you scared of all men or just me?" I seem to have people who ask me these very difficult questions.
Yeah.
But the thing about them is that they do help a person to stretch and to think and to really do your best to answer those questions. And by July of 1977, Jim did propose to me, and so then we went to the office of our then supervisor, Mike Adams, and tell him that we had decided that we were going to make this getting along with each other thing a permanent sort of relationship. He was a very genuine, very real, and another person who was committed to making things better for whoever was around him. And if that meant asking hard questions, saying hard things, doing difficult things, then that's what it would mean, because he was very intentional about that. Our marriage, until it abruptly ended with his heart attack in 1989 on June 19th, was a very good one. We helped each other to grow in ways that some of which were easy and some of which were difficult, but it was a wonderful time.
Tell me about the night that Jim died.
Well, Father's Day had happened, and he had talked with his parents on Father's Day, and they had actually agreed to come to Nebraska. They were reluctant to fly. They lived in Michigan, and they had decided, I think they were going to drive down. I don't remember for sure, but so that was really cool. He was very happy that they had finally decided to do that. Our kids were 5 and 7 and had not met them. We were looking forward to that. But then that next morning, very early in the morning, he woke up and was obviously having difficulty. And it turned out that he had a heart attack, a massive heart attack. And he was only 45, and I've been told then and since then that a lot of times if your first major event of that kind happens in your 40s, you're more likely to not live through it than you would be if you were older and your metabolism was somewhat different when your first major episode happens. So it was very, very difficult. It was just telling our kids and their older half-brother, that their dad was gone was just unbelievably hard. I just never could believe that something like that would be happening. It was a tragedy. We did need to go on, though, and so we began figuring out ways to do that, some of which worked well, some of which didn't. And so that just became a new chapter in what we were doing.
What role did both the Federation and your faith play in your grieving process and your ability to move past, if that is in fact a concept, past Jim's death?
I don't think that people ever do move past something. What you do is you incorporate it into your new normal, whatever that means. And that is where you do still have some choices. The pastor I talked with after it had happened said to me that we all have the capacity to, as he put it, tilt the universe. And we can either tilt it for good or for ill, or sometimes we do, some of both. But our overall decision about what we want to do in that way depends on our core beliefs, values, faith. I am a praying person. I do believe in Christ as my Savior, and I believe that this world is a broken world, and we do need to be saved. But that is a process too, and all of it is a journey. All of life is. And so my faith is the underpinning of who I am, where I go, how I get there, even why I am doing what I do. I strive to be as much like my understanding of who Jesus is as I can. And that does mean hard choices sometimes too. The Federation has been my philosophical home for decades now, and the people in it are folks I depend on for making hard choices, for doing hard things, for having fun, for being a part of life, and realizing that the abundant life that Jesus talks about isn't necessarily all up things, all good things. Abundance just means a lot of something, maybe more than sufficient of it. But that can go in all directions, and I have had and am having an abundant life. There are some really wonderful things and some really not. But that's part of the abundance within which I live.
You've talked about Jim, and we've talked about a couple of your we'll call them professional and philosophical mentors. Tell me about your kids.
Garth, who is mostly goes by Kevin now, he's married and has 6 kids, the oldest of whom is 19, the youngest of whom is 3. So he lives in Alaska, he and Sherry and the kids. Then I have a stepdaughter, Kyra, who she and her husband live in Colorado, and they have 2 offspring. Marcia is actually she's just older than Kyra. They're about 6 months apart, almost exactly. And Marcia was married and has a son named Jameson, who is now 6, and she is divorced now and is dating again. And then Kyra is next in line. And then John would be 35 now. Tragically, he died 2 years ago at the age of 33. And that has been a really difficult new normal to incorporate into my life. But we haven't forgotten him. We continue to celebrate him in many ways. We have a tree in our yard, Jameson named Ardo, A-R-D-O-E, who now sometimes he wants to call Bruce, because we have another tree out there whose name is Spruce, and so Bruce and Spruce rhyme. So, there are lots of things that we could get into tangents about. But anyway, Marcia and Jameson live in Elmwood. And then Ben lives he's a stepson, and he lives in South Carolina now, and went through the Navy, and now is working in the corporate world at Tyson Foods. Anyway, then Emma is the youngest. She's 25, and she is a manager at the Single Barrel in Lincoln, and also is doing some teaching at Southeast Community College. She studied to be a chef through Southeast Community College, and she wants to be a teacher of culinary kinds of things, and is an excellent cook. And she's married now, and she and her husband live in Lincoln.
Listening to your story, it's clear that tragedy is no stranger to you, and the death of your first husband alone was, I'm sure, quite a trauma. And I've been told that a parent losing a child, there is nothing more devastating. People might listen to your story and ask, how do you go on? How do you continue on a daily basis without collapsing, without becoming angry? You don't seem, sitting here talking to you, I don't get bitterness and anger coming from you.
No, I don't feel either bitter or anger. For one thing, those kinds of things rob your energy, and they don't help anybody or anything move forward. So I have chosen not to stay there. Anybody who has gone through anything in life has those feelings. They are some of the feelings that I send on down the river. Sometimes people think about feelings, some of them being like leaves or whatever on the water, and they can just keep going on down. Sometimes you take one out for a little while and discover that you don't really want it anymore, so you can just put it back in there. It isn't that easy, but that is one of the kinds of things that I do. I remember Mrs. Tenbrook, who was the wife of our first Federation president, Dr. Jacobus Tenbrook. I didn't ever have a chance to meet him, but I have met her. And in fact, she was at the first convention that I came to in Nebraska in 1975 as a national representative. And I remember seeing her after the 1990 convention, and I was really sad and having a hard time. And I remember her saying that her husband had said to her at one time, sometimes the best you can do is just keep putting one foot in front of the other, because that helps you move forward. And I have done that. There have been times when that is what you do, to just keep moving forward. I've every now and then been asked to do some scripture reading at church, and if people find that helpful to them, then that's wonderful. We tend to find what we're looking for. If we look for good things, we'll find them. If we look for bad things, we'll find those. So some of it's just what are we looking for?
That's an excellent point. Well, there's a gentleman sitting through the glass. He's actually on deck to be our next interview, and that is your second husband, Brad. Tell us about him. How did you meet him, and how did that come about?
I actually met him back in 1977 when a tragic accident blinded him and did other kinds of things to him that I'm sure he will talk about. And he came to the orientation center here in Nebraska eventually, and so we met there. And even at that time, he asked questions that were interesting to me, like, do blind people dream in color, or how do you draw as a blind person? He was interested in those kinds of things and wanted to find out stuff like that. Even at a time when he was having a lot of issues with the head injury that happened as a result of his accident, trying to get back into the swing of life in general, he still had those kinds of questions, and I found that really fascinating. So we had become friends once he was in the orientation center. He came as a student, and then after he was done being a student there were other kinds of things that kept us in the same circles. His first wife was also a student there, and she and their child also died. We continued to be friends, and there were then, you know, he had other relationships and so forth, but eventually those ended, and one of them was a divorce. That's always a sad thing. But when he first talked to me about being interested in pursuing a relationship with me potentially, I asked him for a year to think about it, you know, and we could do some things together or do whatever, but not necessarily with that as the backdrop. And to his credit, he gave me that time. There were a lot of complications in the relationships that were around then, and I really was interested in knowing how his intersection with those would be continuing if we were going to be together in a covenant relationship of a marriage. And so he did give me that time, and then we started working on our being in relationship with each other and with our kids. Our kids knew each other, and we wanted them to know each other in good ways, and to, you know, it wasn't up to them to decide whether we would get married or not, but we didn't want to enter into a situation where it wouldn't be a good thing for for everybody if we could see to that. And mine were older, so they were pretty much out of the house for the most part, although one of them did live with us for a while. So there was a lot to think about, and I remembered saying to somebody, I was deciding whether or not I was going to choose complicated over lonely, which ultimately I did. and I have never regretted it. We have a wonderful relationship. He is one of the most deep and beautiful people I've ever known. There are a lot of people in this world who I would maybe think of as kind of human doings. They do this and they do that, and they're really up into doing things. Brad is better at being a human being than almost anyone I've ever known. He knows how to go inside of himself, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that he can bring out and talk about, and he has analogies for so many things that really work and make people help people to think about things. His value in being, and he has a tenuous hold on life a couple of times, where with that gun mount accident, and then we took turns having cancer, but his almost took him out. But I knew he would want to hold on to life, and so when the doctor came in and said, well, really, he has cancer. If he lives at all, he's likely to have brain damage, kidney damage, all kinds of other damage. And so the Brad you knew is gone. And I thought to myself, well, I'm not altogether sure about that. What I do know is that he knows how to fight back from the brink. And I know he wants to, because some of the kids weren't all together grown yet, and he wanted to be there for that, and he wanted, there was just a lot he wanted to be around for. And so I said, how about, it was the same doctor who had taken had put the port in me and taken it out when I had cancer. And so he wasn't a total stranger to me. And I said to him, I want you to go in there with I'm praying for your hands and your skill, but I'm also praying for your will and the energy you take in there to give him the best possible chance to survive. Because if you do that, and if you can get him through that, he'll do the rest. He wants to be here. And later they called him Titanium Man, because they really didn't think that there was much of a chance that he would live, but he did, and it was a long, hard road again to come back. But he does it, and he has done it again, and he finds life worth living. And he always says now that the old Brad is gone, and that the new improved Brad is here, and he's more humble and whatever than ever, and things like that. So he's the same guy, just a more experienced version, like we all are, if we allow ourselves to really live our experiences. And that's something that we do try to do, is to live our experiences, whatever they are.
Barbara, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I was wondering if we could fill these 45 minutes, and there's so much we haven't covered. You mentioned your cancer. Is it fair to say that did your faith help you get through cancer? Did you have a lot of support from both your family and your Federation family?
Yes, absolutely. I know that whatever else is going on, and I did some really bad things during the time of my cancer. One of the first being that when I went to do the chemotherapy for the first time, I walked in there saying out loud, I feel like I'm going to the electric chair. That is a bad idea. Nobody wants to go there, and that was terrible energy to take there. And it wasn't a good experience. The things that they gave me did cause me to have all kinds of really peculiar sensations and stuff. And I realized after that particular go of it that I needed, for one thing, to go back there if I was going to do that again with a different attitude. And I did. At that time I had a Zen stone that I had some music in, and I sat there and I leaned the chair back and I listened to music, and I didn't listen to other people sitting around me telling the stories of who made it and who didn't, and things like that really weren't at that moment good for me to hear. maybe they would be good for me to hear later when I could be useful to the people who were saying those things. But I didn't have anything to bring that was useful on those days at those times. And knowing that and doing something different about it was the best thing for me to do.
The Lord may be the master of our universe, but Father Time is the master of this interview, and he's tapping me on the shoulder. But I want to ask you, going back to the blindness issue for a moment, it is Meet the Blind Month. To close out this interview, I want to ask you a two-part question. What do you think is the greatest accomplishment you've seen in your life with regard to blindness and the accomplishments of where we are now?
I think the greatest things are still to come. I'm looking forward to the driverless vehicles and the kinds of technology that can allow everybody to not just maybe see stuff that's right in front of you, which sighted people do, but to have the 360-degree kind of awareness of what's around us that Dr. Kurzweil and others talk about. So I don't think we're there yet as far as the greatest things. But the best thing I think we can do for one another is to stay connected and to really explore what one another is doing, and to be open and honest with each other about the fact that some things are really wonderful and are moving in a good direction, and some things really aren't, and maybe we need to concentrate on helping them to get better for blind people and for everybody, because the things that we do that improve the world for us as blind people are ultimately better for everybody else, too. The typewriter was invented so that blind people could have legible writing, and then a lot of people kind of hijacked it and even started not allowing us as blind folks to to be taught that skill or to get jobs using it. We need to pay attention to stuff like that and not allow people to hijack the very things that we do to make our lives better, or that other people help us to do that, and turn them into bad things. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're moving into a more positive place to be, and a more uplifting one. And, my faith helps me with that as well.
And of course, the other side of the coin is, what do you think our greatest challenge is yet that we have to face, perhaps that came out in the 20th century, in your lifetime, that has yet to be resolved?
Attitudes. Attitudes are everything, and we have been working on that for the very, for all of life. That's what Jesus was helping us to do. That's what, what really runs who we are and what we do. We think ourselves into being who we are in a lot of ways, and that's why attitude is everything, because if we get that right, then the other stuff will follow, because we'll create the kinds of things that are positive for us to work with, to work on, to be part of. And if we don't, if we're all convinced that the whole thing is going down the tubes, we're going to help that happen. So we need to keep always and forever in the forefront of what we do, what our attitude is toward it.
Well, Barbara, it has been a pleasure talking with you today and hearing your insights and your outlook. And thank you for coming in and being with us for Meet the Blind Month here on Community Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And our guest has been Barbara Loos. This is Ryan O. hosting Community Conversations on Radio Talking Book. Please stay tuned for our next program. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.